didn't key this in.
Mm-hmm.
And that's before you even get to the point of like, does anybody even look at the report that you're producing at the end? That's a different problem. But
there are probably people's lives dependent on it, right? In the hospital.
Yeah. Well, this was the billing office, so it was, I was, it's like nobody liked us.
People's lives are actually still dependent on it, but in a different way.
Yeah. I would have been, I definitely would have been on the Luigi list back then.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next installment of Azure Cloud Talk. I'm Alec Harrison, here with co-host Brian and our special guest, Cory ODaniel, CEO of Massdriver. How you doing, Cory?
I'm doing pretty good. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So I think we've looked at your resume. You kind of have some cool feats behind you, but how did you get started with technology? Is it typical, 4-year degree or what?
No. Yeah, I started programming when I was like, I want to say like 14 or 15 or so. And it was literally, I wanted to modify Duke Nukem, which I think is how most people start, I guess. And then I really just kind of wanted to be an asshole on AOL. So I got really into building like AIM like tools. And so like, it was always just something for me that was like, this is this fun thing that you can create like a tad bit of anarchy with. This is fun. But my original major in school was physics and architecture. And so I was doing that for a while. I happened to be in a data entry job at a hospital. And I realized that everything that they were having me enter was coming from a spreadsheet that was being printed out. And I was just retyping it into something else. And I was like, if I just had these spreadsheets, I'm pretty sure I could just like automate me out of a job. And so I did that. I found the person that was printing them and I was like, can you just like put that on a diskette for me? And so we saved the paper. I'm here to save the environment. And so they started bringing it down to me on a diskette every day. And I wrote a program at home to pretty much do all the data entries. I'd read from the spreadsheet and then just enter it into this old like terminal system that we were using. And I just kind of like reverse engineered everything. And then I just sat on my ass for about 3 months at work getting paid, not doing anything. And my boss walks by one day and she's like, what are you doing? And I was reading the Dungeon Master's Guide at my desk, like quite obviously. So I explained to her what happened and they bought my software from me because they didn't have the rights to it because I wasn't a software developer, and then promoted me to like the networking team. And so then I was like, okay, this stuff is kind of cool. I guess I can make some money here. So I changed careers or changed majors. So I was working in healthcare at the time. I'd already had like a bunch of math classes. I went to my dean. I was like, what can I switch to where I don't have to like start all over? He was like, computer science. And I was like, nah. And he was like, healthcare information systems. And so that's what I ended up majoring in because I was working in healthcare already. So yeah, so I did that for quite a while. And then I met a guy in a bar. Sorry, I got a weird origin story. Met a guy in a bar. It was this bar that I used to go to every Thursday. And I would sit there with my laptop in like 2001. It's like no Wi-Fi is in a Starbucks and I'm in a bar with a laptop. I knew the bartender, like he was my buddy, and this other guy comes into the bar with a laptop and I'm like, this is strange. Like it's strange for me to be here. It's strange for someone else to be here with a laptop. And he was wearing board shorts and a t-shirt and I was wearing like a full suit from like coming out of work. And I was like, what do you do that you get to wear board shorts and have a computer? And he's like, oh, I work for a startup in Los Angeles. And I was like, cool. And so I quit my job the next day and moved to Los Angeles in pursuit of joining a startup. And so here I am, 24 years later.
That's a super unique story. It's kind of cool. It's really interesting how people sometimes fall into technology roles just by trying to make their jobs easier, life easier. One thing I've always told people is part of the reason we like the origin story is there's all these jobs that exist that nobody really knows about until you're in the industry.
Yeah.
I remember when I was in college, nobody knew what a Scrum Master was really. Nobody knew what a product manager is, a project manager. Like, there's all these like well-paying like tech adjacent jobs that I'm just like, I didn't even know that was an option when I was going to school. I just fell in like, hey, you're good with computers. Go be like a computer science major. And then I actually had a cousin who's like, go be computer engineering, because then it's from the engineering college, you make more and there's more like areas you can go, because you could go hardware, you could go to software easier.
Yeah.
So that's literally how I ended up computer engineering, was just because a cousin was like, hey, don't do comp sci. I did that. Just do comp E. Look, here we are.
Yeah, it's funny. So like the networking team that I was on, I throw air quotes around that because it was just like, they're like, I don't think the people that ran the hospital, like knew what to call it. And they were like, it was like IT-ish. Like
Yeah,
it was straight. It was all things. They were like a computer, like you do the computer. And so my job was, I was specifically assigned like the task of, I guess, the most physically demanding job in like the IT networking team. And most of my coworkers were like older dudes, heavier dudes, and then I'm like this like spry little 19-year-old. And so I was the most physically demanding job. I did batch reporting, which is pretty much like we had this big mainframe, we'd run some SQL, and it would literally print out like 120,000 sheets of paper. So this is fun. Like to me, this is hilarious because I'm just like, I know what's going to happen to this paper. Like I already automated one of these jobs here, and it would just print out like 120,000 sheets on these huge ass dot matrix printers. And my job was, after that printed, running these reports to like everybody all over the hospital that like needed these reports every day. So I worked from like 11 p.m. till like 6 a.m., like getting all that stuff going and like running it around. And then I figured out how to automate pretty much all of that job except for the running the stuff around part. And so I would usually get in, run a script that would do all the reporting. And then I had set my alarm clock for 5 a.m. I'd go to sleep in the printer room, wake up at 5 a.m. and then run the stuff around the building. So I pretty much got paid to sleep, which was pretty nice.
Wow.
Yeah. That's hilarious. There's a lot of those kind of things where you can just like, I tell people like there's stuff with AI that I think really helps make that a lot easier of automating different tasks. But at the end of the day, like RPA has been a thing like forever of just automating tasks, automating jobs, to your point of like, hey, you're going to take data from this spreadsheet and you're going to put it on this one. Like that's a common job that you could just say, hey, like here's the rule that always fits in there. Maybe once a month, once a quarter, you're having to like manually edit something. But like, I think some people get so like fixed and tunnel visioned on their specific task that it's not like a, hey, what if I didn't key this in?
Mm-hmm.
And that's before you even get to the point of like, does anybody even look at the report that you're producing at the end? That's a different problem. But
there are probably people's lives dependent on it, right? In the hospital.
Yeah. Well, this was the billing office, so it was, I was, it's like nobody liked us. Like
people's lives are actually still dependent on it, but in a different way.
Yeah. I would have been, I definitely would have been on the Luigi list back then. Sorry.
People wouldn't have been upset if you burned all those reports and be like, we can't bill our clients.
Whoops.
Shoot.
Yeah, I'm gonna like zero out some of my family. Like I'm gonna mess with this script a little bit.
Just get some, the whiteout on the spreadsheets. Nobody will notice, right?
Dude, the amount of paper cuts in that job, it was rough. That was the hardest part of the job. Like my hands, I got like an extreme appreciation for lotion in that job. I was just handling hundreds of thousands of pieces of paper every day. I was just like, but yeah, that's how I got here.
Interesting. So how did that progress from, you automating a few things to now you're a CEO? Like, I think you talked about you being a little bit of an anarchist in there, and you've also started the open tofu movement. Like how'd you go from automating some things to going to try to find a startup to now doing what you do?
Yeah. So, I've had an amazing career of just stumbling into what I call luck, just completely ass backwards. And so, I moved out here in 2000, early 2000s. I did not have a job. It was funny when the guy had said like, "Oh, I work for a startup." I misheard what he said. I thought he said the company's name was startup. I had no idea what a startup was.
Nice.
And I was like, what does startup do? Like, I thought that was the name of his company. He's like, no, like a startup. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. And I was like, I have no idea what the fuck this guy's talking about. I was like, is it easy to get a job at a startup? And he was like, oh yeah, for sure. Like you just show up and they pretty much give you a bunch of money. And I was like, what exactly? It's funny.
Nice.
I remember to a T, the guy's definitely, I was like, what is a startup? He's like, it's a bunch of nerds get together, think of a good idea, and then they con some business people into paying for it. And I was like, that's great. I was like, I gotta figure out, this is an amazing industry. This guy now is like one of my best friends, like years later. But I moved out there. I've been working in software development at that point at about 2006. Been writing software for a while. I'd worked in data centers. So like in the hospitals, like I'd worked through, ended up being in a pretty big data center towards the end. And when I got to California, I joined this startup called Ripple TV. It was like pre-iPhone, so it's like people didn't have anything to do back then. So everybody just kind of stood around in the woods. I don't know, for the kids listening to this that have had iPhones all their lives, we really had nothing to do before smartphones. And so this company, Ripple TV, what they would do is they'd put big screen TVs in like places where people just stood around, like at coffee shops and Robex and gyms. People didn't used to like squat with their phones out at gyms. They would just stare at ads on TVs while they ran on treadmills. And so we had these TVs that were kind of, everywhere, all over the place. We'd play ads, we'd play, sports clips, like, and it was all localized. So you'd see like, like local movie times, all this kind of stuff. And we were in a data center in El Segundo, California. So I was on the software team. I'd also worked in a data center. My boss just walks by one day. This is like 2005, 2006. And he's like, "You've worked in a data center before, right?" And I was like, "Yep." And he just goes, "Cool." And then walks away. And I was like, interesting conversation, man. And then about an hour and a half later, he sends out this huge email that he'd obviously been working on for a while about us moving to a little thing called Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
Amazon, this shoe and book company, was selling some cloud computers, and announced that I was going to be leading the migration from the data center to the cloud. And I was like, well, this is a fucking surprise. So I pretty much got pigeonholed into like this, like, okay, I was a developer. I knew how to do operations. Like, you're going to lead this migration. And so I kind of like just started getting pigeonholed into like what is now like the DevOps role, even though it's not really a role. But that's just kind of the world I slowly got pigeonholed in. So it's like I was doing a lot of the operations automation of stuff on EC. And then that just kind of became like my thing. So it's like next company, it's like, oh, we need somebody who knows how to do automations on all this AWS stuff. And so it just kind of slowly became what my expertise was in.
So thinking back to that time, you were tasked with what probably felt like a massive challenge. How did you approach that? Because I'm sure we have plenty of listeners that are like just getting into the cloud, and it can seem overwhelming with all the different services. What was your strategy around that?
Yeah. So it's funny because it's like I've been a test-driven developer for a very long time. Like I have to write things as tests. I have to like see it work so that I can write software. I can't write software without tests. And so the idea of automating all these things like EC2, and I think SQS was the other service they had at the time that we were starting to use. To me, it was mind boggling. I'm like, there's no way to like reproduce this stuff. Like this is old. This is a long time ago for folks who are listening. Like, I don't think we had Git. We were on Subversion. Like Google kind of sucked. Like the Google is like the only thing you could search with. Oh, you could also like Yahoo some stuff. Like it was hard to find. Like everything just sucked. 2000 through 2006, the world was miserable. Right? This is .com bubble blowing up. And so like you just couldn't find anything on the fucking internet. I think I was user like 100 at GitHub. Like when it came out, I was like, oh, this thing might be better than Subversion. And so, it's funny. I called it a dependency resolution framework, but I essentially built an infrastructure as code tool at the time because I was like, okay, like we have this idea of like what we want, but like it's very hard to produce it like locally on like our machines and then in the cloud and then also like in our production environment. And so I built this really shitty Ansible is like the best way to describe it. Like, and the funny thing is like Ansible and Puppet and what's the other one? Mark's, gosh, I can't remember the name of the tool. There was another infrastructure as code tool at the time, or configuration management as it was mostly called back then. But I just didn't know the words to find it. And so I did what any software engineer does when you Google it and you get no results. You're like, I guess I'll go build something. And so, I started building what would be an infrastructure as code tool. And the funny thing is like that was rooted in what Massdriver eventually becomes. So I kind of worked on this tool while I worked at this company. And when I left, I still had it around. And so I'd like hack on it. And I never pushed it back up to the repo. So I just kind of like hacked on it for years on the side. And me and my co-founder, we were working on a side project one day. And he was like, oh, who wants to do like the cloud management stuff? Like he's like, do you want to set up the AWS stuff? I'm like, not really. Like he's like, I don't want to either. We both kind of wanted to write the software. And I was like, hey, I got this thing that I've been cobbling together over the past like decade and a half. Let me show you this really quick. And I was like, I use it to like manage all my Terraform and whatnot. I was like, and I was pretty much trying to be like, you could use this. It's a little easier than doing all that shit yourself. And then he looked at it and he was like, if we put a UI on this, this is a much better idea than the thing that we're working on. And so, ba-ding, like Massdriver came out of it. And so it was written in like it was like Ruby 1 or something like that back in the day. And so we did like a whole refactoring of it to Elixir and Golang. And yeah, so like that's kind of how I wormed my way into CEOing.
Nice.
That's crazy. It's funny how that like an idea that you had just to make your life better eventually morphed into something else entirely different or a whole standalone product. For those, if their listeners aren't familiar with Massdriver, kind of what's your sales pitch of what you're like, what can I use that to help me with? You kind of hinted on it a little bit,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
just
So we're an infrastructure automation platform. So we essentially do IAC orchestration. So tools like Bicep, Terraform, OpenTofu, Helm, pretty much anything that you can use to configure the cloud, whether it's configuration management or infrastructure as code, we're an orchestration engine for it. But the one thing that's very different about us than most other tools in the market is we are a tool that's specifically designed so that your operations or DevOps engineers can offer self-service to developers. So developers can kind of get what they need from the cloud, right? And so when you look at a lot of tools in this space, I think this is a pretty common problem that you see is like, any company you look at, right? I'm an operations engineer at heart. Like most companies you look at, you see this really tiny team that like does all things cloud, whether it's ops, DevOps, SREs, platform, like whatever you're calling these people. And then there's just a whole horde of developers, just this fucking gangs of them roaming around everywhere, right? And we're always kind of seen as this bottleneck. Even like when you have a company with like good DevOps practices, like there's still a bottleneck, like when it gets to compliance and security and like all this other stuff, right? And so this whole move to like centralize yet democratize access to cloud that is self-service, I've just seen blow up on people time and time again. So I worked in consulting for a while with Google, and I'd kind of go in and help companies with doing platform engineering initiatives. And what you'd see is, companies be like, oh, well, what we're going to do is we're going to take some Kubernetes and we're going to take some Terraform and we're just going to fucking hand it to developers and see how that goes. And like
Right.
what happens is like developers have stuff to do. They got 40 hours to work in their week like everybody else. But like now, like the cloud stuff is also kind of their job, but it's also kind of your job. And like the boundaries are vague because we're all DevOpsing, right? And so you see developers just go, I don't want to use this Terraform thing. And so all of a sudden they're clicking around in like the Azure AWS console. And now there's drift. And it's just like the idea of self-service has always been noble, but just kind of a clusterfuck, honestly. And like the thing that really sucks, I think, for a lot of ops people is even if you've given the self-service part and you've aced it, which is hard to do, day two happens. And with day two is like you have zero context is what developers have done. And then when a developer inevitably comes and taps your shoulder and says, hey, I got a problem, you're like, shit, I'm months behind on what you're doing here, right?
Yeah.
And so our idea with Massdriver was we wanted to be able to give people self-service, but we try to do it from the point of view of the operations engineer who has way too much stuff to do that is also trying to make himself more efficient, right? And so some of our core principles are everything in the infrastructure platform and self-service is built on operations tooling. So ops teams don't have to learn new stuff. Whatever IAC tool you use, it works. If you want to change the way the platform works, you write Docker. I'm not asking you to learn TypeScript or React or all this crazy shit you have to do to use Backstage. I want you to use a tool set that you know, right? And so on the other end of this, your developers get self-service. What's pretty cool about it is they get a diagramming interface. So they come in and they just diagram what they need from the cloud. And what we do is we pull your infrastructure as code modules to resolve that diagram. So now developers are doing diagrams. When they tap you 2 months later, or you get an alert that goes off in the cloud, you come back to an actual infrastructure diagram that represents real infrastructure.
Right.
And it's actually backed by infrastructure as code and your policy tooling. So you as an ops engineer know when they dragged out, Postgres flexible server or whatever for Azure, and they deployed it, it adhered to all the rules that you had in your Terraform. It ran checkoff and OPA. Like the developer didn't have to copy 7,000 walls of YAML to make sure that like checkoff is installed, right? Because that's another common thing that happens in self-service. Like, oh, you gave me a bunch of Terraform modules. I just have to call them. It's like, well, you forgot to copy all the pipelines that run compliance and scanning. So now we're fucked again, right? And so you essentially package all of this stuff into what we call bundles. And those are the things you can put together on the canvas and connect together. So it makes it really easy for a developer. They just have to know how to diagram stuff. And then it makes the whole day two much easier because an ops engineer, you can see the context, right? You don't have to go, oh, how many applications are accessing this database? You can literally look at the database and you see lines to all the applications that are using it. So it makes self-service to an engineer feel native to them. They don't have to learn Terraform. They don't have to even speak the language of ops. And operations is able to guarantee all of these things to developers without hoping that developers are going to learn their tool and not go around it.
So with your tool, I've been looking for some sort of scenario like that where I could just take my diagram that I made in draw.io and basically get the generation of the infrastructure of code from it is your tool actually writing the bicep, or is there a library of known bicep that it's drawing from?
It's that one. So you
Okay.
publish yeah. So this is part of the like the discovery and like what we call the pre-approval process. So a lot of what we do is try to get your infrastructure to a state where what developers are self-serving is pre-approved. They're only allowed to do what they're allowed to do. And this
Nice.
stops the amount of like post commit, like shoulder tapping for like, hey, can you open a service now ticket to say I'm allowed to do this? And oops, I didn't set encryption, so let me ask the security guy to review this PR and I got it wrong, right? And so we have a couple of phases to what we call pre-approval. So one is your ops team is actually writing these infrastructure as code modules. They do it just like they normally do. You can take the modules that you already have, you drop in either an Azure DevOps pipeline config or a GitHub action, and that publishes them into the Massdriver like Canvas tool. And so now your developers start to see these services appear on the side. Oh, I need Postgres. They only have to know. What's really nice about it is like you can kind of obfuscate it from them. So you can just say like, hey, this is how we run Postgres. Might be Azure Flexible Server, might be VMs, might be cloud native Postgres. Like it doesn't matter to the developer. The operations team has said, hey, here's the abstraction I want to give you for the thing that you need. I'm going to hide all the details and I'm only going to show you the fields that matter to you. So now I drag Postgres out into the canvas and say, hey, I need an app. We have two ways of deploying apps in our company. We have Azure App Service and we have Helm charts. Great. Mine's a Kubernetes chart. I'm going to drag a chart out onto the thing, put my Docker image in it, right? So you get these very high level abstractions for the developers, but it's all your infrastructure as code tooling. And then what happens is as you're dragging those boxes out, we know what Git repo that is. And so we essentially take the parameters that they kind of fill in on the diagram. We actually have this really cool, when you're familiar with like, the Terraform's Open to Who's the World, they have this concept under the hood called a DAG, directed acyclical graph. So we actually have a larger DAG in Massdriver. We give you not only the DAG that's in your Terraform code that kind of figures out what order to run stuff in, we actually push the entire graph into that module as well. So now your application can say, hey, what is the IP address of the Postgres that I'm attached to, right? Now you're not doing secrets of like, where's the host name, where's the password. You can actually project information across this graph into other modules, right? And so what you get is this point where developers are just like, hey, I need Postgres. And that's all that's their constraint. They maybe set a version, maybe a couple other things. And all of the secrets access, firewall management, everything else is handled under the hood by your real IAC and this graph that you have. So I could say, oh, I can see this is using Postgres. We have a module to resolve how we do authentication for Postgres. Developers need to know about that. Principle of least privilege IAM, firewall rules, secrets are injected directly into their Helm charts or their Azure App Service. And the developer's like, I just said I needed Postgres 14 and I'm back to work on my feature. And you as an ops person go, I know that they didn't copy and paste a password because that's just how the canvas works, right? So you kind of guarantee these things that are very hard to guarantee when you give self-service with just like the raw tool.
So let's say that you're doing something like, if I put a VNet out there, I'm typically going to have the same exact subnets in it every time. And I can parameterize like the IP address for those. But, a different service, like an app service or something, there's, all kinds of different configurations and it might be a different need. Are you saying the developer would have to still kind of know something there and you'd have to have different templates, or you would have at least parameterized the templates in a way that I could say, I want this premium, I want networking, I want different things connected to like Key Vault or whatever, or like how would that work?
So what we find is so the platform is extremely customizable. So at its base, like what it does is it's effectively scheduling Docker containers that have some sort of IAC tool inside of them. And then we have this type system, and that the lines on the graph are actually the type system. And so you can say like, hey, we define Postgres as this type, which happens to have the information for accessing secrets and firewall rules, right? And so what we find is best is like when your organization has like standards and non-negotiables for like how things work, like how you want to standardize stuff, building the interface in Massdriver, it's fully customizable. Designing that interface around like your like lingua franca, like how you talk about it at your organization. So we've seen a lot of really cool things happen here. So like a common pattern, we actually introduced this in some of our public modules, and the amount of customers that are just like, this works better than the way that we do it is awesome, is we have this type for networking, and it can essentially project like, hey, this is a public subnet, an internal subnet, or a private subnet, right? An internal subnet can't access the internet. A private subnet can access the internet, but can't be accessed from the internet. And public one is, a gangbang of networking, right? And so what's cool is now I can just say, hey, all of my things that need to be on a network, they just accept this subnet module. And what I'm going to do as an ops person is say any database can never be in a public subnet. And so now when I drag something onto a canvas, there's just a drop down for me. I can say, is it internal or private? And so the developers are getting like a very small view of the world. They're like, oh, this is the database that does not need to access the internet. Or maybe I'm using Postgres and it's using like foreign data wrappers and I need to access some weird service someplace else. So it does need to access the data. So I'll just set it as private, right? And then behind the scenes, what happens is you have a Terraform module or a Bicep module that reacts to that subnet type. And so it can go, oh, I can see on the graph that there's this VNet over here. The developers requested a private subnet. You can either find a private subnet to put that thing in, or you can say, oh, I can see what the CIDR is here, and I know how many nodes I'm going to need for this Postgres instance. I'll do the CIDR math and create a new subnet for them. So you can essentially define your rules of how this works. But what's cool about it is like, instead of like this being a checklist somewhere where somebody's like, hey, this is how we do networks for these different databases, like check the networks and then like do that in your Terraform. Like you just do it once as a module that's essentially recomposed over and over again into these bigger like bundle modules.
Nice. So if I'm interested, is there tutorials available or like videos on that, or how does that work?
We do a lot of videos. I think we got pretty good docs. I'd also say like if you are, I assume you guys have a bunch of people that are on Azure that listen. So there's a really great program called Microsoft for Startups. It's part of Microsoft's Founders Hub. And we're actually the infrastructure partner for that. So if you go through Founders Hub, Microsoft for Startups, and you apply for it, it's pretty much if you have a business and a LinkedIn account, they approve you, and you get up to, I think it's $100,000 to $150,000 of cloud credits. And then as a part of that, you get Massdriver for free.
Nice.
So we have a free trial. We have like a small plan. We also do like free for any open source projects, but this is a really great way to like get it in, like have it for a prolonged period of time and also get like just a boatload of cloud credits. But we do a lot of docs. We got a lot of stuff up on YouTube. We try to make good docs. I hope our docs are good. Somebody told me once that they were bad and I felt really, really bad. And we just did like a whole like sprint of just like trying to make the docs fantastic. So there's a lot of different stuff out there.
So if I'm a consultant and I'm doing, infrastructure work for 7 different companies, how do I convince them that it's okay that I use this across all the companies?
Dude,
and they're not sharing their code?
Consulting, it's funny, like the businesses that have been attracted to our product that we did not expect to be attracted to our product is crazy. So like our 3 biggest like verticals are healthcare, which is to me was insane, but like now that we're starting to get a lot of healthcare companies, it's starting like I think it's funny because I made a post on this a few days ago on LinkedIn. With healthcare companies and insurance, so these are our main 2. Our third is consulting companies is our third. And it's funny because like when we started getting healthcare and insurance companies, I was surprised because I always think of these companies as slow, right? It's like, oh, they don't have budget. It's hard to attract talent.
Right. 6 months release cycle.
Yeah, but they're companies that do want to move fast. They want to be more agile. They have this, right? Like they can't be the Zuckerbergs who are like, move fast and break shit, because when you break shit, people die, right? Like, so like they have to move fast safely, right? And that's a hard thing to do. But what's wild is when they find a tool that actually like lets them have that compliance up front as a pre-approval process, they love it. And so we've just started seeing like a bunch of healthcare and insurance companies come in because like they can essentially codify, right? Like this isn't static shit that's happening later where we're like, oh, is it compliant or not? Let's see if we should approve the PR. It's like your stuff is pre-approved. Like it's impossible for a developer to make something that will fail compliance, right? Like you can define your constraints up front. And so I'm literally in the interface and it's like, I can't make a database that's not compliant to our standards. And that's what they want. They're like, I can move fast and not break stuff and guarantee compliance. So those are like our top 2 industries, but the third is consulting companies. And what's wild is there's definitely like managed service companies who are like, oh, we'll manage your cloud for you. But where we see a lot of customers come in as these consulting companies where they're software companies. We're like, hey, we either come in and we work on a product for like some big enterprise company, or we work for startups that want to build new products. And they are paid for delivering a product. They are not paid for setting up all the cloud shit. right? Like to them, this is a thing that they have to do to get to the part of the business where they can start to show value to a customer. And so with tools like Massdriver, what they tend to do is they say, okay, you know, I've got these very common patterns that I'm deploying to these customers to be able to get to the point where I'm running my Rails app because we always write Rails, or Python because we're a Python shop. And so they'll do is they'll develop a bunch of modules. Massdriver, we have multi-org support from the get-go. So they'll just make an org for like each one of their customers and then just essentially like just drag a blueprint out of like, hey, this is how we run our Rails app that we always kind of sell to people as like the product that we, you know, like the baseline, like we're building you a Rails app, we'll do this, or we're doing some ML stuff, right? And so they'll design the infrastructure once, they have all these modules, and then they'll just reproduce it into all their different customers' accounts. And what they're seeing is they're to the point where they're delivering value much faster because they're not having to do all this cloud stuff. And then if they're like, hey, I found an issue, they can make the change in one module, roll it out to all their customers. And it's not like they're chasing customers down saying, hey, like, you know, there's a CVE and Nginx ingress, I need you guys to update this. They can just make it, roll it out for them. And the customers don't know the wiser in should they have to be disturbed by it, right?
Yeah.
And so it's really wild. Like I was surprised to see consultancies. It was one of these things where I was just like, I'm like looking at our reporting one day and I'm like, this one guy has like 15 different organizations. Like, what is he doing? And I was like, oh, he's making a lot of money is what he's doing. I was like, we need to figure out a customer plan for consultants specifically. We have not done that. So they're just making a lot of money off of us, which is fine. Make that cheddar, guys.
Nice. So the other thing about this is the standardization that you would get as the consultancy would be invaluable, right? Because now I can have, you know, one team or three people that have built these really well. And even if a couple of those people leave and we get two new people or whatever on the team, we have these standards in place. And we know that if we go deploy to customer A, we do this, it's going to be right. And then we don't have to worry about, well, you know, the new guy wants to do IAC this way versus we used to do it this way. No. And where if you don't have something like Massdriver, then you've got customer A doing it one way, customer B doing it. Now you're supporting two different product configurations for the same end result. And now with this, you have a standardization that, I mean, that's invaluable to me.
Yeah. What's funny is like the connective tissue, like our artifact system, the lines, it's usually, it's the thing that's like most overlooked because like people think it's just like a UI decoration, right? And then when people get into the lines and they're like, well, you can program these lines to do things. Like, I think that's where people's minds just, but the things that the lines also do is they let you communicate between infrastructure's code tools, even different ones. So like you can take a Helm chart and you can take a Terraform module and you can project information from that Terraform module into that Helm chart, right? And when you think about like a new team member joining and how you do that today, you're like, oh, I've got this Terraform module that makes a network and I've got another Terraform module that makes a Kubernetes cluster. The Kubernetes cluster needs some subnet information and it needs the VNet ID and it needs all this. Like, how do you get this stuff from one module into another? Well, maybe you take TerraGrunt and you've got two different modules and you're piping them into each other. Or, you know, what if it's in two different repos? Okay, because right, I make the database, I make the network, but we let the developers make their own databases. Okay, well, how do we get the network information? There's this manual piece of meat that gets introduced like into the pipeline, right? And with Massdriver, that stuff just projects across that line. It's like, oh, you connected it to this VPC. I'm going to project whatever we've defined as a network. I'm going to project that information across the line, right? And that's where I think it really becomes powerful because you're not like your first day coming into a company that's using Massdriver. You're not sitting there looking at a GitHub repo with 125 Terraform modules trying to figure out like, hey, if I'm standing something, the developers just requested 3 different services. I got to figure out how all these modules piece together and how to pipe these values from one to the other. And do I make it one big module and one big lifecycle, or is it 3 different ones, right? Like the really cool thing about Massdriver is every single one of those boxes is its own tiny little lifecycle, right? So you don't have to worry about like, oh, if somebody accidentally destroys the Helm chart, does it take down the database with it? It's like, no, they're all these very, very micro state files because everything's extremely small, like centered around the abstraction that you've given the developer, right? So it gives you more clarity on your first day because you're like, you can look at a canvas, and go, oh, I get how all these things piece together. And there's this type system that you can see like in your code that's like, oh, I'm going to project a VPC. I'm going to receive a VPC. And then in your Terraform code, you don't see all these like very low level attribute fields where it's like, oh, what's the VNet ID? What's the subnet ID? What's the whatever ID? It's like, I receive a network and it's like, oh, this is this big complex type is going to come across and it happens to turn into like an object in Terraform a wild ass map and Helm.
This tool makes me reflect. So I was in the same boat when my first gig, we joined a client and they were like, oh, we have infrastructure as code figured out. We have pipelines figured out. When we got there, we were supposed to build like a .NET Angular app, yada, yada. We landed and the pipeline turned green every time there was a push to the repo. That's it. It just asserted true was true. And I'm like, so as the young guy, I was like, well, I just graduated from college. I'll read the documentation. I don't care. I'll learn Azure. And then I became the Azure expert because it was also the time that Microsoft was switching from ADAL, which was like an open source auth library, to like an actual Microsoft branded one. But they also gave the guidance like, hey, don't use ADAL anymore. MSOL is our standard, but it's not production ready yet. So we had this fun thing at the client too of trying to figure out, one, a lot of their vendors would put auth to the end because they were like, well, if we run out of budget, security by security, which I'm sure would make security professionals freak out because they'd be like, oh, we're delivering on features that provide value. And they're like, yeah, but we don't want the whole world to be able to find this thing.
Yeah.
That's a you problem now because we're out of budget. So we tackled that early on. And, I know I'm not unique. I know I'm fairly unique, not super, but like I was learning Azure DevOps pipelines. I was learning ARM at the time and it sucked. I had a developer on my team at one point I was like, guys, I'm hitting a roadblock, and just kept hitting my head on the wall for like, I think it was like a week. He's like, oh, I'll help you out. I'll take a look at it. And after 30 minutes, he's like, I can't figure it out. And I'm like, yeah, if I was spending a week on it. But to your point, like you could then have the only module I think they had at the point was a SQL server. So they had the firewall rules, they had the networking, they made sure there was no public access, but that was about it. Otherwise, everything else was, hey, you're on your own. Like, okay, well, do I turn easy auth on? How do I do authentication authorization? How do I connect my front end to my back end? Do you even want the front end to be stored on the same app service plan? Like all these things that like I had to learn and figure out and then be like, hey, architect, here's what I'm going to do and why. And they're like, got rubber stamped kind of thing. And the ops team got into this vicious cycle of they were trying to support so many apps and they were on fire because they didn't have time to standardize. And they didn't have time to standardize because everything was on fire. And then, the ops team is then in that infinite cycle of I can't dictate standardization. And then you have all these other issues when security starts coming in for audits, right? Then it's, hey, prod might be down, but here's a security issue that's high priority. Like, okay, are my customers more important than security? And they had to make those, rough conversations and calls of prod being out is probably more important than security issues.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Well, it's funny because what happens with the product is, I think operations people's, this is going to sound like a startup CEO, but I think an operations person job becomes more valuable when they use Massdriver, because what happens is you go from constantly doing these one-off tasks for people, right?
Yes.
And what we're trying to do is like, when you look at a lot of companies, like everybody's trying to figure out how to get to platform engineering now. And the reality is it's very hard to jump to. Like if you're in a low DevOps maturity model and you're like, we're going to do platform engineering, guess what? You're just going to fucking rebrand that team. They're going to be doing the exact same things they're doing today. They're just going to be making more money, right? Like you have to go up this DevOps maturity model to get there. And so what we're trying to do by like focusing on tools that ops teams know is kind of, you just keep doing the stuff that you know, but the work product like output is much higher, right? You've designed a standard around this Terraform module, and now anybody can use it. It's not you trying to figure out, okay, we've got good Terraform, now we got to figure out how to get some good pipelines. We got to get developers comfortable with Terraform, and we got to like work our way up this like tedious, torturous ladder of DevOps maturity. You can just get really good about developing tools, and you're actually Massdriver, like the platform is responding to this stuff. So you're actually seeing effectively like a GUI pass for your developers, like get built as you're just writing infrastructure as code. And what's really interesting is what we usually do for customers when they come in is like they try to figure out like, what do we start with first? And it's funny, like you'll see people like, oh, we got a data center we need to migrate. And I'm like, dude, don't fucking worry about your data. Don't try to migrate your fucking data center with this. Like, what is the thing developers ask you for the most? Let's do that today. And then let them get it. Because now what happens is you design that construct once, developers can get it. You can have like oversight and guarantees that your stuff's in place. And now all of a sudden, you have a ton more time because that most common task is now handled by somebody else, which now lets you say, okay, let's take a deep breath and figure out how we migrate a data center to Azure or AWS rather than trying to like rush through it with this new tool, right? But what's always awesome is like, instead of your job being like, you're always trying to serve your customer that is this engineer, but now you're trying to serve them all instead of just trying to serve one, right? We're trying to design platform as a product. That's very hard to do. So, but when you're just like developing IAC and the product is kind of forming around that, it's your job as an operations person is starting to think about product and thinking about abstractions and think about like, how do we serve the constraints of the business while also making a good interface for developers and like focus on DevX versus what are the 20 things I have to do today? Which is like what the job feels like a lot. It's like you sit down, you look at ServiceNow, and you're like, shit, people need a lot of databases. And also there is a security breach and like production has like 10% errors today. And you're just like, where do I start? Right. And like you start to get to this point where you're like, your job as ops is like you're designing these concepts and then you're handling anomalies, right? Because you have a lot of people that now have standards and they're consistent across these environments. You know that your Postgres is mostly consistent. And you get people who come along and they say, hey, you know what? The module that you built for me doesn't work. That is a very transactional Postgres module, but like we actually need change data capture and we need all this other stuff that the rest of the teams aren't doing. That's fantastic because most of the teams have fallen into that 80% use case and they've given you the time now to focus on thinking, okay, well, how do we design a module? Is it an additional module that attaches to our current Postgres module? Or do we need to rethink a separate Postgres module for like higher transaction and like real-time replication, right? It gives you the headspace to think about these other constraints in the business and these like more anomalous, like less common things rather than just have it like get shoved onto your plate in the like pile of commodity shit you're dealing with day in, day out.
Yeah, that's super awesome. I think I like how you just basically described like the plot of the Unicorn Project and Phoenix Project, right? Of like unplanned work, trying to make work. Because then you also have the issue of if you get to that transactional mode of you just have 1,500 ServiceNow tickets or whatever, everybody's pointing fingers at you that stuff's broken. And how do you report out that like you're actually helping? It's like, yeah, the stuff you're doing is breaking things and now everything's broken and you're the bottleneck. It's like, hey, if you can start getting to that higher level of, hey, here's self-service, here's productivity, people are less likely to point fingers at you specifically. That's kind of like a system level thinking versus just like a transactional level thinking of how quickly can I pump out.
And it's hard because I think honestly, I think if you look at most businesses that are in the cloud, I would say your operational team, no matter what you call them today, like they're the unsung heroes of the whole thing, right? And it kind of sucks because I feel like a lot of times, like you'll see a product manager walk down the hall and be like, "Hey, you know, Donald, great job at making the button green. It clicks faster, yay!" And it's like you see Rufus over there on the ops team is like, nobody ever high fives me. Nobody's ever like, "Yo, this thing hasn't gone down in 6 months." Like that's my work, right? It's hard to be seen for your work because you're this hard to see platform that developers sit on top of and people see your work when shit's broken. Right. And like that sucks. Like that sucks. Like we don't get a ton of attention.
The only time my boss ever comes to my desk is when there's a problem.
Yeah. You see him show up. You're like, oh shit. You're like, I'm in the bathroom. It's like, I can see you. You're sitting right there. It's like, oh shit.
I promise I'm not reading the Dungeon Master's Guide.
Yeah. It's kind of
like it may have been the Monstrous Manual. I think it might've been the Monstrous Manual.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't remember. It was a long time ago. I'm old.
That's awesome.
I hear that.
Cool.
I had another question. It sounds like you're still kind of working with the consultancy kind of like model for your business, but do you have plans or a space? Like say a consultant listens to this and says, hey, we'd like to do this. Can we partner with Massdriver?
Yeah, so we actually do this in multiple ways. So we have customers today that use the product for their customers. It's funny, like we have this like multi-org model, so you can make multiple organizations, you can kind of transfer them. And so like, it really depends on the agency. Like some agencies like do the full manage and they manage the people's compute and cloud forever. And others will like build a product and spin them out, right? And so this actually creates customers for us because they're like, hey, we use Massdriver. The customer's like, hey, we hired a software team. They don't really know cloud stuff. And they're like, well, we'll just transfer the org to you. Right. And then we have another customer, which is great. But also in the future, if they're like, hey, we need to re-engage with this consulting service, the consulting service is like, oh, I'm familiar with this tool. Like you guys maybe have added some more Terraform modules to it or whatnot. But on the other side, like we get customers all the time who come in and they're like, hey, we want to start using this. Like we also have like, we don't have enough hands to do all the stuff that we need to do. And so it's kind of like we don't like advertise it as like a two-sided marketplace, but like when we have customers come in like that start using the platform, we'll introduce them to our consulting partners and be like, hey, this is a person that's used the platform a ton. They've got 8 different customers that they're managing with it. You know, they can probably help you with your cross cross-cloud migration stuff. And so we kind of have this like nice little network of like, hey, some of our consulting partners bring us customers. When we have people that come in and they need like, fractional ops work, we'll introduce them to our different partners. So it's pretty serendipitous.
Yeah, this sounds super cool. I even think of like, Brian, some of the open source projects we do for just like infrastructure as code, or just like getting out of the way of some of the ops stuff, right? Of just like, hey, here's modules, just deploy your, static web app. And now we're going to talk about the actual meat of other things. I think it's a really cool tool. It sounds super neat. I think about, if the company I got dropped into fresh out of college had this, like, what would my career path look like? Like, would I still have even cared about the cloud or Azure? Because as a dev, I learned ops just to try to help and expedite like us being able to build apps. That's kind of how I got into the cloud. If they just had something like this completely figured out, like, would I have cared? Would I just be like a rockstar .NET developer and just not even cared about the cloud at all? It's kind of interesting.
I think it really would depend on like what your interests are. I think ops people that use our product, when people see it at first, like sometimes they're afraid of it because they're like, oh, like I'm not going to, like, this is going to take my job away. And it's like, no, it changes like the scope of your job. And what's funny is like, you're doing more of the part you like. You're writing Terraform, you're thinking about cloud services, like you're thinking about the constraints, like you're building a product versus throwing together some Terraform really quick because somebody's asked you for something, and then throwing together some Terraform really quick because somebody's asked you for something else, right? Like you're getting to have this like systematic, like repeatable way of going about things and like actually getting to design. And so it's funny, it's like, internally at Massdriver, we all kind of have like our specialties. And it's like, I pretty much run like most of the like database modules that we have in like our core like public library. And it's like, it's funny, I don't do ops day in, day out anymore, but it's like I've been working with databases professionally for 24 years now, right? And I know the most on our team about like database management and scaling and stuff like that. And I sit down and I get to think deeply about like how I think that the average developer who doesn't have cloud experience should interact with and use Postgres, right? And like I sit down and I get to like reflect on like my years of experience versus like, hey, a customer wants us to do Postgres and they don't have a module for it. Can you throw together something really quick, right? Which is never like a rewarding way of going about your work, right? And then it's like you come back and you got 25 Postgres modules and you're like, why did I design this one this way? Like, I think it's more rewarding work because like you're always, like you're actually building a product. Like we're creative people. Like it's a computer science degree, but I honestly, they should have changed the name of that shit a long time ago. Like it is, to me, it is an art. Like you think about product, you're developing something. There's humans that have to interact with this stuff. They're going to read it, right? Like, and that thought and that care about the code, I think is generally more interesting and more important than like the computer science nature of it. And I think that's what you start to get to with the tool is like, you're like, I'm thinking about product all the time and like how I want the experience to be on the other side of this. I'm not thinking about, a task that is like wearing at me because I do it every single day.
I'm thinking about how I can build this so I know it's compliant and I don't ever have to think about compliance again.
Yes, that's also nice.
Or worry that I forgot to flip the switch on the one thing that makes us NIST whatever or ISO whatever.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think it's funny too. I think that's sometimes what separates like mid and junior level devs from like seniors or principals is that the art, the craft, the thinking more systematically versus just like, I need to make the button green today or whatever, right? It's that higher order thinking and giving people the space to do that and be creative is always cool, especially different tools, products, just sometimes changing the way we work. I think we're running pretty close on time here, Cory. I don't know if you have any last minute plugs you want to do or any last leaving thoughts you want to add.
No, I mean, I feel like I usually try not to talk about Massdriver so much. So I feel like I hope I didn't annoy your listeners that this just turned into an ad.
Awesome.
Okay.
So
yeah,
I'm glad you did.
It's to the disdain of my VCs. Like I am not a marketing person. I just like to talk about nerd shit. So I'd say, I don't know, find me on Reddit, find me on LinkedIn. And, I don't know, I talk about this kind of stuff all the time. So share your thoughts. I love feedback. I like seeing people, conversations online about tech stuff. And then check out the Platform Engineering podcast. It's not too shabby.
Nice.
Awesome. I'll have all the links in the description for that as well. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see everybody next time.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you.